Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Why IT Compliance Isn't Enough to Keep Your Organization Safe. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Jennifer Grant, Consulting Senior Manager in our Business Risk Services Group, and Troy Hawes, Senior Director of Cybersecurity. And with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer to get us started.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome, everyone. I am excited to be with you all today, so thanks for joining us. October is actually Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I believe it is in the 17th year, so today's presentation is perfectly themed and timed for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. As is the agenda that we pulled together for the presentation today. We'll discuss the difference between compliance and security to understand why compliance programs may not be sufficient to protect organizations from the threats that we're seeing today. Troy's going to walk us through some of the threats, particularly due to COVID-19, and we'll discuss what an IT risk assessment is and why this can be a powerful tool in addition to your compliance programs. And then I will wrap us up with some common pitfalls to avoid when conducting an IT risk assessment and some key takeaways from our presentation. Here are our learning objectives for today. I won't read all of these, but the goal for you is to walk away today understanding compliance versus security and really how an IT assessment can help your organization. So with that said, we are going to jump right in with our first polling question. Please remember to submit your answer, and I'll turn it over to you, Emily.
All right, thank you. Our first polling question today: does your organization have any compliance requirements or frameworks that need to be met, such as PCI DSS, HIPAA, SOX, or CCPA? And your options are A, yes, B, no, or C, I don't know. And I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate in our polls today, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. About 5 more seconds here. right, let's go ahead and see what everyone has to say. Back to you.
Thanks, Emily. So as expected, most of you, like most companies, have at least one type of regulatory or compliance framework that you're obligated to comply with. So here's a list of common compliance frameworks. Many you're probably familiar with. Obviously, there are a lot that are not listed here, and looking at some of these may give some of you heartburn when you think about them. And while each of these frameworks were designed as a means to mitigate risk, they are often not a holistic approach when we think about security risk management. So basically why we're here today. So I'll pick on just a couple of these. We'll start with my personal favorite, which is SOX. You know, most of us know the Sarbanes-Oxley Act seeks to protect investors by improving the accuracy and reliability of financial reporting. And as part of SOX, many companies and auditors have adopted the COVID control framework for guidance on control objectives to meet SOX requirements around IT. Now, COVID itself goes beyond controls needed for internal controls over financial reporting, but in the context of SOX, the typical security-related controls we would see are really around having a defined security policy that includes key elements like password management, appropriate segregation of duties, and authorization controls around user access. Again, these controls are narrowly focused to data, systems, or applications that impact financial reporting. So they may not cover other systems that have confidential data or intellectual property, and they definitely don't include the types of controls you would expect as part of a well-defined security program. Controls like security monitoring, incident management, security awareness training, or threat and vulnerability management programs. And while I'm seeing many clients and auditors adopt a questionnaire-based analysis of a cyber program, cybersecurity really only becomes relevant to SOX to the extent that the losses from a security event impact your financial statements. So when that happens, you are required to disclose the information of the event and the impact to the organization, and you'll have to look to underlying controls that could prevent those types of losses from happening again. But again, it's not technically a requirement of SOX. I can say that having had the pleasure of participating in some PCAOB reviews this year, cybersecurity is certainly becoming a hot topic, and it's something we get questions around frequently. So more and more, we're seeing auditors, regulators, and even investors are more interested in a company's overall security strategy and what controls they have in place. But again, while it's technically not in scope, it is something that is growing attention. Another one I'll touch on is HIPAA. HIPAA standards are a great start to an organization's data security strategy, but again, they may not be enough for a comprehensive program as they are only focused on protecting a specific type of data, so protected health information. HIPAA requires a lot of security-related policies and procedures, like taking precautions around malware, keeping an updated training program, and reporting on any security incidents. But it doesn't really mandate what type of encryption standards you should be using, or maybe best practices in password configurations. So HIPAA laws were established, before maybe this age of cybersecurity. So HIPAA compliance might not necessarily protect you from cybercrime. So we can go through various compliance frameworks and find guidance on security measures that are necessary to be considered compliant, but really we shouldn't be relying solely on compliance requirements as our definition for a company's overall security strategy. In short, compliance does not equal security. However, security is typically a part of compliance. And I don't want to undermine compliance frameworks. I don't want to imply that compliance frameworks are not valuable or useful. They are often very helpful in finding shortcomings in security controls. But what I want us to keep in mind is that the threat landscape is changing, and it's changing rapidly. Compliance frameworks can be narrowly focused on only specific parts of the business or type of data handled. Compliance frameworks can give vague requirements. They might not be prescriptive enough to really understand what is expected. So companies may only be implementing the bare minimum when it comes to security. And then within a compliance framework, it can take time for a regulatory body to actually come out with updates to the requirements. So companies really should be cognizant of growing risks and trends and not wait for a regulator to deem something important or critical or high risk. So this is why we believe it is important that organizations proactively and methodically evaluate IT risks across the entire organization and not rely solely on a compliance strategy to mitigate threats and responsibilities. So rather than viewing compliance and security as separate elements, we should really look at them as two concepts that sort of run parallel and sometimes they intersect. So what are some indicators that your compliance program is not offering sufficient protection against these threats and vulnerabilities? The most obvious would be your company is experiencing an increasing number of security events. Shortly, Troy is going to discuss some of these threats we're currently seeing, so I'm not going to dive deep here just yet. Another one may be not having a defined security strategy or program. Maybe you are a smaller private company and you don't meet the requirements for some of the major compliance frameworks I shared earlier. In this case, you may have only implemented minimum security requirements and you're thinking, does my company really need to invest in a security program? Hackers aren't worried about us, they're going for the big guys. And I think that's a common misconception for a company to think they are too small. It should no longer be a question of, will I get hacked, but when? Today, smaller companies make up over half of cyber breaches, and the impact of that can be pretty costly. So spending the time upfront to understand your risk profile and build out a security strategy or program can be invaluable. It'll save you time and money from later possibly having to recover from a breach that we know can include legal fees, recovery of lost data, business disruption, and certainly damage to your company's reputation. Another indicator may be the lack of a security culture or not being cyber aware. And this goes beyond just an annual security awareness training, which is certainly important. But what I'm really talking about here is the collective responsibility to protect the company and its assets. It's a company's tone at the top when it comes to security and how that message influences everyday action by everyone within the company. And I emphasize this because experts consistently point to insiders as one of the biggest security threats. Employees within every company are considered the biggest risk when it comes to security breaches. Phishing scams and malware targeted at insiders are incredibly successful at creating a security event. So it's critical that companies start on the inside, start with its own people, and really look at building a strong security culture and promoting awareness from the top down. This morning, I actually read a really great article on cybersecurity metrics. And in this article, they discuss metrics around the number of intrusion events. So how many times a bad actor has attempted to gain access to your network, how many unidentified devices are actually on your internal network. Do you know that number? This is typically personal devices from your employees. Knowing how many devices on your network are fully patched and up to date. The average time for your security team to both detect and respond to an incident. And then how many users on your network have elevated or administrative privileges. And so thinking about these metrics I think if you aren't tracking some of these, or you can't even answer some of these questions, I think this too can be indicators that maybe your company should be doing more when it comes to security. So to sort of drive home this idea that compliance is not enough, here are some other factors to consider that are leading to an increase in security risk and some important questions your company should be asking itself. So technology. Technology is everywhere. We know this. It's at work, home, it's in the cloud, it's on our phones, and it's multiplying quickly. And data. When we say data sprawl, we are referring to the sheer volume and variety of data that businesses are producing daily. So ask yourself, does your company know of the technology it's using and how that technology is being used? It is so much more common than you would think to see sort of operational teams, business teams within the business, not get their IT group involved in technology decisions and in acquiring technology without their involvement. So IT has no idea about different systems and applications running throughout the business. And the same about data. Does your company know where all of its data lives? And what types of data has the data been classified? And being able to answer these questions can better prepare you to defend against security threats. And talking about threats, obviously there's an increasing number of threats, an increasing sophistication of threats. Every time you turn around, it seems, there's another or a new type of threat in the news. Like I said, Troy's going to walk us through some examples here, but I would ask you, is your company aware of the threat landscape, and has it been evaluated? And have they considered the impact that it could have on your organization? Another factor is unforeseen risks, and you can't have a presentation today without mentioning COVID. How many of us could say that we even had a pandemic listed as one of our top risks? Or if you did, where did you put the likelihood and impact of a pandemic actually occurring? COVID has affected everyone. It's affected every business. It was an unforeseen risk to most, and it won't be the last. So how can you improve your security posture to better adapt to unforeseen risks and to be more agile in being able to respond to them? Funding, talent, and resource constraints. Many companies simply don't have the budget, the expertise, or other resources to identify and handle security threats. And when you mix the growing complexity of the security landscape with a shortage of talent or budgetary constraints, is your organization left unprepared and exposed? And finally, I'll talk about third-party risks. So these are cybersecurity threats to your organization that originate outside of your walls. I am sure your organization shares some level of data with vendors, service providers, subcontractors, the list goes on. You may have heard of a data breach last May, so May of 2019, between Quest Diagnostics and a vendor that provided billing services to Quest. A hacker had breached the service provider's webpage and able to collect, a massive amount of Quest patient data that included names, date of birth, social security, addresses, payment-related information. And a month later, by June of 2019, that service provider had filed for bankruptcy. Also, when it comes to third parties, many companies may place too much confidence or reliance in security when they move their data to the cloud. So we're using a third-party-based cloud solution, we're safe. They are under the false impression that if data is in the cloud or if it's with a third party, there's no other due diligence required by them. But it is still the company's responsibility to protect their data. When it comes to third parties, ask yourself, do we understand how data flows in our organization? And do we know the steps these third parties are taking to safeguard that information further down the chain? All right. So I think that actually takes us to our next polling question, and I'll turn it back over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Our second polling question, what cyber threats keep you up at night? And your options are A, ransomware, B, hackers breaking into my network to steal sensitive information, C, accidental breaches or leaks by authorized users, D, scammers posing as my employees to target our customers, or E, all of the above. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Troy now, and as I've promised, he's going to take us through some recent cyber events, particularly during COVID-19.
All right, thanks, Jennifer, and appreciate everybody answering that polling question. It really is kind of all the above, but it really depends on where your risks might lie. And nowadays, nothing has really changed with COVID and how cyber criminals are attacking us, but what they've done is they've just ramped up their approach based off of what scares us, and that information is really what's they're using to really attack organizations and people these days. And we'll go through a few of those here. So one of the impacts of COVID is that it has compelled organizations to allow their employees to work from home in order to maintain business continuity. This entails shifting a significant portion of the workload to be carried out remotely. This moves more people outside of the internal network protections and introduces more opportunities for attackers. The opportunity attackers see is the mass use of remote login credentials to organizational resources that have far exceeded the norm. As a result, remote connections are established by employees and devices that have never done so before, meaning that an attacker could easily conceal a malicious login without being detected, and they have more targets to try and exploit because of this. IBM did a study in the early days of the work from home orders and found the majority of the people surveyed use their personal laptops for some sort of work. These devices are usually not as secure as their company supplied one, and often they're using the device because the tools they need to be productive don't work on the company devices. However, obviously this increases the risk of data sprawl, as one of the items that Jennifer mentioned earlier, now where our data could potentially be spread to these other insecure devices, and those are going to be easier to be breached than the company devices. Unemployment fraud is among the top COVID-19 scams. In fact, scams increased by 400% just over the month of March, making COVID-19 the largest ever security threat. The Federal Trade Commission says coronavirus-related scams have cost Americans over $13.4 million so far this year. These scams are started with an email or a phone call. In fact, email phishing has been one of the biggest threats during the pandemic. Emails and phone calls from cyber criminals are conducted in order to collect sensitive information or by chance to install malware on a system, such as ransomware. In April, Google blocked over 18 million malware and phishing emails on a daily basis that were all related to coronavirus. Phishing is not new. This has been around for a long time, but one reason why breaches have occurred more frequently during the pandemic is because employees report they're more easily distracted when working from home. Thus, they are more likely to fall victim. With the possibility of a second stimulus check, scammers no doubt are already ready to pounce once again. Attackers have also registered hundreds of URLs or domains with names associated with Zoom, WHO, CDC, coronavirus, and others in order to lure people to malicious websites. There are over 40,000 new domain names just using the word coronavirus alone. Some of those may actually be legitimate, but the majority are going to be malicious. Again, the goal is to lure people into going to a malicious web page that might install malware or ask you to download this video conferencing software. And what that has done is people have downloaded this information and again infected their system, and that's what's caused a lot of the breaches and security incidents recently. So during the initial days of shelter-in-place orders, people were forced to work from home. IT professionals were overwhelmed with making employees productive at home. This meant that making systems operational were the primary objective, while security and compliance requirements had to be dealt with at a later time. As we've seen, cyber criminals do not rest, and they pounced on all the new security issues that arose due to the work from home orders. As such, it's more important than ever for organizations to use risk assessments to help identify risks within their operations due to these new external threats and demands that have come about. Organizations need to evaluate their remote connections, such as VPNs, to ensure they're secure, as there have been a number of attacks and breaches reported due to these insecure access points. Organizations also need to evaluate policies and possibly document new procedures that account for working from home. Employees need to be trained constantly to help ensure these systems or their systems remain secure. Emily, I'll turn it over to you for our next polling.
Thank you. Our third polling question: how often do executive leaders or board members receive updates on the IT risk posture in your organization? And your options are A, at least once per month, B, at least once per quarter, C, at least once per year, D, we don't have regular updates right now, or E, I don't know. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. We'll give everyone just a couple more seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Okay, well, thank you. And so the importance of, getting executive management, board members, others that know where these IT risks lie, that's a critical portion of this risk assessment process, and we'll talk through that in a little bit. So the ones that you don't do regular updates now, or the ones that don't know, that is a critical piece to make sure that you're at least doing it. And I would say best practice would be on at least a quarterly basis, so that they understand where these risks reside and how the organization is going through and mitigating the risks. So always being updated on that. So we'll turn it back over to Jennifer for a slide here, and then we'll I'll take you through the whole risk assessment process.
All right, thanks, Troy. Before Troy really dives into the risk assessment process, I want to talk about some of the benefits of doing a risk assessment. So a risk assessment is, let me get that slide going, sorry. An IT risk assessment is a comprehensive review of the IT organization. The objective being, identify the flaws that can be exploited and really threaten the security of your network and data. But it does more than just tell you about the state of security of your IT infrastructure. The most obvious benefit is that you will identify weaknesses in your environment and have the opportunity to correct those before they are exploited. But at the end of the process, you will understand your company's risk profile. So a risk profile describes potential risks in a lot of detail. It will tell you the source of the threat, the likelihood that the threat will occur, and the impact should the threat materialize. But because no organization can completely eliminate risk, an IT risk assessment helps to provide focus. And by understanding these details, companies can stay focused on the high impact, high probability risks. This can help justify security investments, get additional funding for security programs, or maybe it will identify areas where the company can actually eliminate spend that is being put towards mitigating less likely risks. The assessment also helps you gauge the awareness of security threats and vulnerabilities by individuals within the organization. We talked earlier about having a security culture, and without a doubt, we see these assessments consistently point to the need for more security training and awareness. And a risk assessment can demonstrate to employees that security is a significant concern for the company. And when employees are educated in security best practices, they are more likely to recognize and report these types of security events. You will also have a better understanding of the maturity level of existing security controls and tools that your company may be using. You can see how efficient your security controls are, where you have preventive versus detective measures in place, understand what's working and maybe what isn't working. It's a great way to facilitate decision-making around the company's security program as they look to plug holes, maybe enhance compliance requirements, or maximize or upgrade current investments. One of the benefits that's actually not listed here is just the value in actually having a formalized assessment that is documented on paper. I think this can be helpful in the event you ever do have a breach and you maybe have to provide proof to your insurance company of the security measures that were in place. Or maybe, as I mentioned, as regulators or auditors or even business partners are more interested in your security efforts, this is a great way to provide evidence of your company's due diligence. I think there's also value in putting pen to paper of having an inventory of your IT and data assets, which Troy will talk here in a minute when he talks about the risk assessment process. But when changes are made or new risks arise, it makes it easier for the organization to understand where their critical assets are and how can they move quickly to respond. So now that we understand some of the benefits of the risk assessment process, Troy's going to dive in and describe for us.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So risk is a business concept in that anything that threatens a company's ability to achieve its financial goals is considered a business risk. This includes risk to technology, systems, and data. 3 factors play into risk determination: what the threat is, how vulnerable the system is, and the importance of the asset that could be damaged or made unavailable. We'll talk through this whole process on the following slides here. So in order to protect your business from reputational, financial, regulatory, and strategic risks, you must prepare with the effective technological risk management. At a high level, a risk assessment has a number of steps, and we'll go through each of those. First, it starts by understanding and identifying all assets within the organization. This includes hardware, software, and data. You'll need to then classify the asset. For example, if a system holds sensitive or proprietary information, that system should be classified as high risk. For an example, an ERP system that holds financial information, customer information, and other operational information could be classified as a high risk, along with any of the supporting systems, such as servers and databases. Next, we need to identify threats to the asset, such as a hardware or software failure, malware, human error, hackers, or denial of service, to natural disasters and obviously pandemics. All could be a threat of some sort to the asset. The next step is to identify the vulnerabilities to the asset. A vulnerability is a weakness that a threat can exploit to breach security and harm your organization. Vulnerabilities can be identified through a number of ways, such as conducting vulnerability scans or performing security assessments, to reviewing vendor data and alerts. In our example of the ERP system, we would need to identify vulnerabilities within that application, such as a lack of logical access controls, to vulnerabilities within the server and database operating systems using vendor information or vulnerability scanning. During the threat and vulnerability analysis, it's good to include information security personnel or third-party vendors that can help identify vulnerabilities and the exploitability of that vulnerability. Now we need to analyze the controls that are in place to minimize the probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability in the system. Controls can be implemented through technical means such as antivirus, encryption, intrusion detection mechanisms, and identity access. Non-technical controls include policies and procedures, user access reviews, and physical and environmental monitoring. These technical and non-technical controls can be further classified as preventative or detective controls. Preventative controls attempt to anticipate and stop attacks. Examples of preventative controls are encryption and multi-factor authentication. Detective controls are used to discover attacks or events through a review of audit trails and intrusion detection system alerts. Next, we assess the probability or likelihood that a vulnerability might actually be exploited. The type of vulnerability, the capability and motivation of the threat source, and the existence and effectiveness of the controls need to be accounted for. The categories high, medium, and low are usually used to assess the likelihood of an attack or other adverse event. In order to assess the impact a threat could have, we need to evaluate the criticality of the system and the sensitivity of the system and its data to determine the impact that could be caused by a compromise or harm to the assets. An attack or adverse event can result in compromise or loss of information system confidentiality, integrity, and availability. As with the likelihood determination, the impact on the system can be assessed as high, medium, or low. Now we need to calculate the risk score based on likelihood and impact, and taking into account the controls in place to help mitigate the risk. A useful tool for estimating risk in this manner is a risk level matrix. Oftentimes this is documented in an Excel spreadsheet or represented as a heat map. When we determine a risk score, we need to assign values. For example, likelihood can be assigned a value of 1 to 5, ranging from rare, unlikely, possible, likely, to almost certain. While impact can also be assigned a 1 to 5 scale for negligible, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic impact. Risk is calculated by multiplying the threat likelihood value by the impact value, and the risks are categorized based on those scores. So if we have both likelihood and impact at 5, and we got that asset at 5, we're going to have a pretty high score. So in our example, if we're using this rating scale, a high risk would score anywhere between a 15 and a 25. Medium risk would score between 6 and a 14, and low risks are scored below 5. There are a number of ways that risk can be measured, and each organization needs to determine the best method for them. So once we've determined the risk level of the various assets, we are able to determine the actions that management and other control owners must take to mitigate the risk. High-risk issues should have corrective actions taken as soon as possible, while medium-risk issues should have corrective actions developed within a reasonable period of time. Low-risk issues can either be accepted, or maybe there's additional corrective actions that need to be taken. The final step in the risk assessment process is to develop a risk assessment register to support management in making appropriate decisions on budget, policies, procedures, and so on for risk mitigation. This register can be documented in a spreadsheet, and there are many examples and templates of risk registers on the web. For each threat, the register should describe the corresponding vulnerabilities, the assets at risk, the impact to the IT environment, the likelihood of occurrence, and the control recommendations and remediation activities. Remember to focus on the business reasons for each improvement that needs to be implemented in order for management to understand the need for risk mitigation. And that last piece is probably the most important piece, because the executive management board needs to understand what's the risk to the business and what does this mean. So it's really important to make that clear. Emily, I'll turn it over to you for our last polling question.
Thank you. Our final polling question: how would your organization benefit most from an IT risk assessment? And your options are A, evaluate the strength of existing security measures; B, identify and mitigate threats and vulnerabilities; C, serve as the basis for defining a security strategy, policies, and better justify security investments; or D, all of the above. And once you have completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll give everyone just a couple more seconds on this final poll. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, the answer is probably all the above. You're going to benefit in all of these different ways from doing a risk assessment. And probably the big thing, and if an organization is just getting started, this is it might hit on A, B, or C more than all of them. But in actuality, you're really going to gain a very good understanding of where your risks are and what you need to address. With that, I will turn it over to you, Jennifer.
All right. And I'll just kind of echo, I think an IT risk assessment really is a great tool to gain what I like to call actionable insights into addressing risk and, maybe constructing or updating your security strategy. And with that said, we'll end here really with talking about some of the common pitfalls we've seen when performing this type of assessment. All right, so if you are going to, invest time and money into conducting an IT risk assessment, here are some things that you should be aware of that can really weaken the overall effectiveness of that assessment. First is treating it as a discrete evaluation. We know how critical IT can be to helping an organization reach its overall goals, whether that's launching a new product, expanding into a new geography, or maybe improving data available to your customers. Technology plays a key role in all of these strategic initiatives. So IT risks cannot be evaluated without consideration of their impact to the enterprise as a whole. IT risks affect and are affected by other security and business risks, so they really should be viewed within a business context. And I think, if your company doesn't have an enterprise risk management function or perform an enterprise risk assessment, that's something we could follow up on later. But I think incorporating IT risk management into the enterprise risk assessment or overall risk management function kind of helps and leads into the second bullet, and that's making sure to get the support of senior leadership before conducting this type of assessment. You want senior leadership to support this endeavor. So when you can relate how breaches and vulnerabilities can really impact the business by defining those risks within a business context and thinking about, people, your supply chain, contract obligations, and many more. And this can help senior leadership understand where their business vulnerabilities lie. The next one we touched on a little bit earlier in the presentation, and that is around the frequency of the assessment. So performing an assessment once or infrequently can certainly provide a business with a good baseline of where they stand from a security perspective, but that data will quickly become stale, and with the rate at which technology is multiplying and the more frequent targeting and sophistication of threats, new vulnerabilities can be introduced into your organization at any time. This will continue to challenge the integrity of your security strategy if periodic evaluation and updates aren't made. The recommendation we make to clients is that they should perform this assessment at minimum on an annual basis, or more frequently if there have been changes in technology, business processes, products, the competitive landscape. Another common pitfall is once a company performs an assessment, they sort of trip up in the process of developing clear, actionable steps as a result of the findings, and then aligning them with the organization's IT strategy. There has to be a clear path forward that management really buys into, and there needs to be someone charged with owning the remediation plan and driving it forward. I think this is really key to getting full benefit from the assessment. Finally, whenever performing a risk assessment, it's always important to understand your organization's risk appetite. If your organization does have a well-established risk management function, knowing or understanding the risk appetite may be something you're familiar with, but to others, this might be a difficult question to answer, and it may be something that you need to work with leadership to define. Because as a result of the assessment, you're likely going to have to develop a remediation plan and you want to make informed decisions on where the company is going to invest those resources to improve its security posture. You really want the organization to align, and you want leadership bought in. So that's the end of the presentation that Troy and I have prepared. Really I'd like to wrap up with a few key takeaways. And that's, we believe now is the time to conduct an IT risk assessment. Due to COVID-19, IT threats have expanded. The threat landscape in general is rapidly expanding. So it's important that organizations actually take the time to assess their risk. Using requirements from compliance mandates will help get you started on a risk assessment. However, the scope for compliance may only include a subset of IT systems and data that need to be considered from a security perspective. And finally, make sure the assessment is actionable, it is used to mitigate risks, and it's done regularly. So that includes our presentation today. I believe we have just under 8 minutes remaining. So Troy and I will be happy to take any questions. I see we have some in the chat. And if we don't get to your questions today, they are logged, and we are happy to follow up after the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. So we do have some time for questions. If you have questions that you would like to ask Troy or Jennifer, please submit those in the Q&A window. And let's see here what we have so far. Let's start with, are there best practice templates or examples of risk assessment and heat maps that you can share?
I can probably take that first, and Jennifer, if you want to chime in. So there's a number of different risk assessments that are out there and templates that are out there. I mean, you can do a Google search on just risk assessment template and see tons of them. It comes down to really identifying one that works for your organization. There isn't any one that is better than the other. And what you want to kind of rely on is, are you doing this risk assessment at the enterprise level? Are you doing this risk assessment at a department level? Are you just doing an IT risk assessment and that's all that you need? So there's definitely tons out there. They have multiple ways or multiple checklists that you can use to help get started on identifying risks. Because the hard part is first figuring out the threats and the vulnerabilities. And so using or getting information on the various types of threats that an organization might have is really a first process, especially from an IT perspective. One of the areas that we use quite a bit is information from MITRE. It's M-I-T-R-E. They actually have an attack platform that they've created that identifies various methods attackers could use to breach systems. So there's a number of different threats and categories that are out there and very useful from a security perspective in kind of the realm that I use the information for. So that's where I would start. And then if you actually have a compliance requirement, so maybe it's HIPAA, maybe it's PCI, maybe it's other, you could use the information from those compliance frameworks to help build out your risk assessment. However, one thing that we mentioned, we don't want to focus just on select information. So if if we are a healthcare organization or if we have protected health information, maybe there's other sensitive information in our organization. Maybe there's employee information, financial information. If there's that other information, we don't want to just focus on HIPAA then. We do want to make sure that we deal with these other areas as well. So good thing to do is to take a look out there, make sure you find a good template that makes sense to you. There are a number of risk assessment frameworks out there. The NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have a couple of good ones that can be used. So they have what's called a Special Publication 853. They have a NIST Cybersecurity framework. These are examples of tools or controls that can help identify risks. And they can be used as kind of a template to really identify how an organization is doing. There are others. HITRUST is another organization that has built a risk management framework, initially built for protected health information, but they've actually moved away from that. They're moving away from just protected health information to any sensitive data and the protection of that data, and using controls based off of the NIST framework, based off of ISO 27001, another security practice, to help create that risk management framework. So there are a number out there. Jennifer, I'm not sure if you've come across others.
No, I think you mentioned a lot of them, and like you said, you know, it is easy to Google a lot, and kind of how those templates or examples of heat maps, you know, I think a lot of them look the same. You know, I think what you would get from us, you know, can kind of look and feel the same as well. But no, I think you covered that.
Great. And we are just at the top of the hour. Oh, wait, we have one more question that we can squeeze in here. Are tools needed to conduct a risk assessment?
Yeah, so I can take that. And probably the biggest thing is from a tools perspective, there's a couple of things to think about. There's these GRC tools, or governance risk compliance tools, that can be used to help map risks within an organization. It's all based off of the controls that are then mapped to a compliance framework, mapped to a risk, and using that. But you also need to have, you don't necessarily need to have that, but you need to have a way to identify vulnerabilities. And to identify vulnerabilities, you may need a tool such as a vulnerability scanning tool, or having a third party perform vulnerability scans and penetration tests. This is a good technical way to identify vulnerabilities within the system. And what those really do is identify maybe it's missing patches or configuration issues, things like that, and categorizing those into high, medium, and low. And so you're already getting risk information from that, and might be a good way to or help augment the risk or the vulnerability identification as you go through that process. Otherwise, if you're just getting started in a risk assessment process, you're going to need a spreadsheet. That's going to be your initial tool. You'll see the templates out there, out on the web, and really that's the easiest way to get started.
Great. Thank you for that, Troy. And thank you, Jennifer, for a great presentation today. We are at the top of the hour. If you have more questions for our presenters, again, you can continue to submit those in the Q&A window, or you may reach out to them directly using their contact info in our speaker bio widget. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.